I see people entering the room. Welcome, everybody. I'll just introduce myself, and then there'll be a small cascade of introductions before we get to our incredible talk today. So I'm Caitlin Fisher. I'm the chair of the Department of Cinema and Media Arts, and I'm also hosting this wonderful talk as part of my third year class on cinema and games in our Department of Media Arts, our program in Media Arts, our new stream. So it's a very exciting initiative, and we're really thrilled today to have somebody coming in who's working in interactive media to talk to us today. So I am going to first introduce our moderator and somebody very close to CMA, my doctoral student, Jos Humphrey, who's an amazing artist and practitioner in her own right. And today we'll be contextualizing the talk and helping us to work through our questions. So take it away, Alison.
Thank you so much. So it is a total pleasure and honor to be able to introduce my brother Jos, who I've known for a little while, and to help you learn a little bit more about what he's been up to with media arts, not just creating animation, but more broadly creating this interactive special. So just a brief bio on Jos. After studying psychology and philosophy at McGill and starting his career in Toronto in graphic design, Jos moved out west to study hand-drawn classical animation at Vancouver Film School and entered the industry at a time of rapid technological change. Jos has worked for most of his career with WildBrain, the world's leading independent kids content company, which was formerly Studio B, then DHX Media, and now is home to such brands as Peanuts, Teletubbies, Strawberry Shortcake, Caillou, Inspector Gadget, Johnny Test, and Degrassi. Jos's 20-year career has included animating, storyboarding, writing, and directing on 2D animated series including Kid vs. Kat, Martha Speaks, Pound Puppies, and Transformers Rescue Bots, as well as the theatrical feature My Little Pony, the movie. He's currently one of the directors on Netflix's Carmen Sandiego, which received 2020 Emmy nominations for Best Directing for an Animated Program and Best Special Class Animated Program. And now it is my honor to hand it over to Jos Humphrey.
Thank you, Alison, for that, that great introduction. It's great to be here. When Alison suggested the idea of this, I said, yeah, that sounds great. That sounds, this sounds very fortuitous because it seems like I am probably a very good person to talk about something like that because I actually did it. And I think I might also be able to hopefully add my own experience from the context of being normally just a regular storyteller, linear storytelling. That's what all my career has been. That's sort of my wheelhouse and what I'm most interested in. So in the production of Carmen, when this came up to do an interactive special, it was really interesting to, I guess, come at it from the point of view of a skeptic. So instead of someone who was seeking out doing interactive storytelling, I was like, you know, but what? The audience gets to decide what happens. I don't get to decide. I'm the director. I want to decide. I want to control it, you know. And so it was a real learning experience to sort of struggle with that within my own instincts and sort of learn what strengths the medium has, what disadvantages there are. And it wasn't just me, it was a whole huge pipeline, as I'll explain. It was a whole huge pipeline of people, and we all had to learn on the fly this very new way of doing things and figure out all the challenges and figure out solutions. And ironically, because the class is studying this stuff, I'm going to be talking about things and you guys are like, well, yeah, obviously, like, of course that would come up, or of course you would do it that way. But for us, it was like, oh gosh, here's this issue that we hadn't really thought of. I can give you a little bit more background about myself. In the course of, as Alison said, 20 years, which is kind of startling, I've been able to do a lot of different things. I started out animating, I've done storyboarding. When I was directing on Pound Puppies, I got to write an episode. So I got to take it right from the story pitch idea through writing the outline and then the first draft. And then I got to direct that episode as well. That was a real high point, being able to both write and direct the episode, which was really cool. But basically, as a director, I get to do all these different things. I get to talk to the writers about what are the story arcs these characters are going to have over the season, or like a really specific thing, like what's the one word that makes, like, this line of dialogue isn't quite ringing true. We just need to change this one word or change one thing. And sometimes I get to talk to the animation team about, okay, we're going to have this sword fight between a fencer and a Japanese sword fighter. And what's that going to look like? What fighting techniques does a fencer going to use with their sword versus like Japanese sword fighting techniques? And how do those two go up against each other? Which, for anyone who's watched the TV show Carmen Sandiego, happened in the last episode of season 3, which is the season that just came out in October. That was a highlight. But also, like, sometimes I'm talking to an animator about the speed that an expression changes or where a blink happens, like something that specific. And sometimes I'm working with the composers and talking about, like, we need to end this sequence with a real kind of open, unresolved sense. So can we change this chord progression? And I just love being able to do all these different parts of my job. So I'm very lucky, and I love my job, and I'm very happy to share some insights with you guys here about the interactive special. So yeah, so partway into the making of Carmen Sandiego, we have this new challenge. We had already done 2 seasons of the linear storytelling, doing episodes one at a time, and here's the beginning, here's the middle, here's the end. This is what happens, then this happens, then this happens. And we were presented with this challenge from Netflix of doing an interactive special. And it's really understandable why the appeal of trying this, because it's never been possible before. Obviously, the possibilities of streaming platforms and just the technology and the distribution that Netflix has means they can do this. The same interface that lets them have their viewers navigate their library and make choices in their library. They figured out, you know what, we could do that in the middle of an episode and have different clips queued up, and like you go to one and you go to that clip, and normal broadcasters could never do something like that. And probably the closest, well, obviously video games did similar things, but we all know, of course, the Touchstone reference of the Choose Your Own Adventure books. But those were fixed on paper and weren't quite as dynamic as the kinds of things that you can do with on the Netflix platform. And so there was a huge amount of potential there, and it was an exciting challenge. But I had some initial sort of skepticism about, like, well, how is that story gonna work? Like, it's not gonna be a story because I'm not gonna be able to control it. We're not gonna be able to control, like, the beginning and the middle and the end. And it was just an interesting challenge to come into. And over the course of doing it, and also in thinking about it after the fact, I've gained a real appreciation, I think, for the potential and what it can offer. And there are still trade-offs, of course. There are trade-offs with everything. But I think it does have a lot of really interesting potential that I think has been shown in a bunch of ways. I think Bandersnatch is a fantastic example of the pinnacle of what this kind of thing can do. And I certainly wouldn't say that we reached that pinnacle with To Steal or Not to Steal with Carmen Sandiego's, but I think we made a really good go of it, and I'm proud of what we did. So let me give you an overview of the production, just so you understand the kind of scale that we were working on. I was curious about what the students in the class are sort of putting together and the resources they have to do this, partially because of the amount of stuff that we had going into making the Carmen Interactive Special. So I'll just go through the list. On the production, there were 6 writers, 14 voice actors, 6 storyboard artists, 5 storyboard revisionists, 30 designers, 34 background artists, 6 character builders, 58 animators in Vancouver, 23 animators in Manila, 10 animation supervisors, 12 compositors, 15 coordinators, and I probably didn't actually count the coordinators properly, but there were at least 15 coordinators, 3 video editors, 15 audio and music editors and engineers involved in various parts of the audio, the voice acting and the sound effects and all of that, 2 composers, and 1 educational consultant. And that doesn't count all the administrative and technical underpinnings of a big studio like WildBrain, where you have the whole IT department that has to keep everything moving, and all the other administrative and accounting and lawyers and all that stuff. So there's a lot of people. And we started working on it in the summer of 2017. That's when the writing started. And we delivered it to Netflix, I think in about April of 2019. So almost 2 full years. And of course, all those people weren't working on it the whole time. Various different people work at different stages, but it was a really big project with a lot of people involved. And it had some interesting challenges, and challenges that would sort of come at us on the fly as the testing happened, because since the interactive special was like such a new thing, there was always sort of testing happening and trying things out and like, no, that doesn't work, we got to change this. And I'll show you a quick example. Okay, we've got this script here. So this is the final draft of the script. So as we open, right off when we open, details TBD, to be determined, but as if we've been dropped in the middle of an action movie finale, Carmen grabs a relic in a hairbreadth stunt, evades pursuers, and dives from a plane or leaps clear of an explosion, all in the space of 10 seconds flat, as we freeze frame on her action pose. So that was the last version of the script, and the original earlier drafts of the script didn't even have that opening. We just started right into the sort of the main part of the story. But it was determined that we needed an upfront tutorial to sort of teach people about the interface. And this is something that happens a lot with these interactive specials, is people need to learn how to navigate and how to control the story. So we had to come up with this, we called it the James Bond opening, like a Bond movie, where you just sort of come into this action-packed opening that doesn't necessarily relate too much to the rest of the story, but starts things off with a bang. And so we had to come up with this opening of her being in London and bursting out of this museum with a generic kind of Egyptian relic in her bag, and use that to sort of go into a freeze frame and then create this. That's where we get introduced to the metaphor of Chief, who works for Acme and most of the time is a hologram on the show. Chief is the one breaking the fourth wall, talking to the audience and saying, hey, so we brought you in, we need your help. You're gonna have to help Carmen make these choices. This is how the choices work. And then I can just sort of show you the other elements that went into making that opening. So for that opening, this is what it looked like in the animatic.
Carmen Sandiego. She's really something, isn't she? But we didn't ask you here today to sit back and watch Acme case file footage. We reached out because Carmen needs your help.
That's the animatic. After the animatic, which is basically black and white storyboard drawings, goes to our design team. We're working with this amazing design studio called Chromosphere out of LA, who do just incredibly, incredibly amazing work. And one of the things that they do the character designs and various other things, but one of the things they do is they do what's called a color script, where they sort of block out the general color look and the mood of different sequences. So you can see here, this is the color script that they worked out for the opening. In London, they went with this very cyan kind of blue palette. Part of the reason we did that was because of the detail. On Carmen, we really like to have authentic details about the region, the different regions the show travels to as much as possible. And one of the things is, unlike in North America, where emergency vehicles have red and blue lights, in London, and I'm pretty sure in most of Europe, emergency vehicles always have just blue lights. So we knew this whole opening was going to have a lot of police cars with blue lights flashing. So that, I think, went into the deciding to go with this sort of cyan blue color palette for the opening sequence. So that's the color script. And then we can just look at, of course, the final, which if anyone who's watched it. I assume some people have. You can see what the final product looks like.
Carmen Sandiego. She's really something, isn't she?
So that's sort of a quick overview of the animatic to final animation. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if anyone wants to hear more details about that. But the sort of one of the principal challenges that we came up with in doing the thing right away is normally, well, we approached it, the overall content for the episode was about 60 minutes. And we broke that down into being roughly the same amount of time and resources as 3 of our normal episodes. So we sort of scheduled the same amount of time as we would do for 3 episodes. A really sort of tricky thing about that is that animation is really expensive to make. All those people I listed, they don't come cheap, of course, and there's a lot of them. So normally when we do the show, there's sort of a one-to-one of the stuff we make and what goes up on screen. And of course, with interactive storytelling, there's the dilemma of if you have A-B branches, 2 options, and you keep doing that, after the first branch, you've gone from a 1-to-1 ratio of people watching your stuff to a 1-to-2 ratio. Now, half your audience is maybe on one branch, half the audience is on the other. This is, of course, not accounting for rewatching, which you hope people do, but you can't really count on that. So now you've got a 1-to-2 ratio. You put another branch in, all of a sudden you've got 1-to-4, 1-to-8, and really quickly the money, the resources you got to put into this stuff is getting diluted because the people watching it are not all seeing all of the stuff that you're putting into the work. So how do you deal with that? And of course, as I learned at the beginning of this from seeing the stuff you guys are working on, you know all about the different options for branching stories. So we had to figure out ways to sort of get the balance between making sure our resources were going as far as possible in terms of making a really good story for people to share, and letting the viewer feel like they were really playing an active part in shaping what was happening. And that's a tricky balance to get. And so in thinking about the different sort of challenges, I sort of figured everything falls into 2 general categories, the challenges that we came up against that we discovered in working on it. The main ones being, how do you handle the story? What's the story? What's the narrative impact of the challenges that you face? And the other part being, how do you execute it? What are the technical challenges that come up? And so I'd like to do a little poll to let the audience decide which of those 2 things we want to handle first. Do you want to go with the story stuff, or do you want to go with the structural stuff? Or the third option is, do you want to leave it up to me? Because I will tell you I have an opinion about it. I think we should do one before the other, but it's up to you guys if you want me to make that decision or if you want to make the decision. And I guess, I don't know how long we'll give everyone to make that. This was part of the challenge we came up against, is how long is the timer? How long is the choice timer? Like, how many seconds do you give people to make their decision? And actually on Carmen, it was dynamics. In certain places, we gave people more time than in others, because based on the decision that was being made, we felt sometimes we wanted to give it more urgency, and sometimes we were like, no, we're gonna give them time to think about it.
We had the poll, and Caitlin gets to share it whenever you say go.
Oh, okay. So we had, what's the story? 28%. How do we do this? The structure, 26%, and dealer's choice, presenter decides, 47%. So you've got the kind audience of so.
Well, that's very interesting, and maybe we'll have time to talk about that at the end. Okay, so my choice is to talk about the story stuff first. A lot of obvious considerations, narrative continuity across the different paths that we had to deal with. Normally when we're working on an episode, the script is everything, but we very quickly realized that in making an interactive special, as you guys all know in your class, the script becomes half of it, and the flowchart becomes just as important. So this is the actual internal flowchart that we used on the show. This is version 9. I don't even think version 9 was the last one. I'm pretty sure we got up to like version 13 because we would tweak stuff a little bit. And what's really interesting is in prepping for this, I found that somebody, of course somebody had done this. I found on Reddit that somebody had made their own flowchart, had mapped things out. And honestly, I think their flowchart is clearer than ours in terms of showing the linear path of the story. So they show game start, which floor, ground or top, steal vial or rescue. Their flowchart is really good for sort of showing as a viewer's experience. The flowchart that we had to do was also partially a technical document. So it needed to show all of the different technical things. So one of the things that Netflix can do, of course, is they can tell what platform somebody's watching the show on. So they know if you're watching on a laptop, they know if you're watching on your phone or on a smart TV. So they can, based on that, they know what kind of input device you have. And we had to create different tutorials based on the different input devices that would get sensed. So whether you're using a remote or a game controller or a mouse or blah, 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 we had to generate different versions for all those things. And so one of the things that the flowchart does, of course, is lets you really track the order of things in the different paths and which choices have led to which outcomes, what stuff you sort of already got in the past that you need to remember going forward, which you guys already kind of know a lot about, it sounds like, from the class. But one of the big challenges we had is that the approach that we took was pretty quickly it was decided that it was important not to give the viewers, or not always give the viewers, a clear choice between right and wrong. Not to give an obvious moral correct thing, because when you do that, the choice becomes a more obvious moral decision. You're like, and then it becomes about whether the viewer simply wants to do right or wrong, and some will want to do either. If you take out the moral guideposts and you don't sort of let them know, like, you know, do you want to kick the puppy or do you want to pet the puppy, that kind of a thing, it becomes, the viewer has to sort of engage more of their own preferences. And it feels more arbitrary because they're like, well, I don't know, what do I do? But that's sort of the point, is the viewer then has to sort of get more engaged in making the decision and use their own preferences. And of course, sometimes people might be like, well, the classic thing from the Choose Your Own Adventure books is you make one choice and then you go and it's like, oh, and you fell off a cliff. And you're like, well, how could I have known that that was going to happen from the choice that I made? But that's sort of part of the point of having the less of a clear sort of telegraphing of where the choice is going to take you. Another big challenge that we had for the story was how often do these choices happen? Because with it's a tricky balance when you're presenting the episode, when you're presenting the story. If you wait too long between choices, the audience goes back into their just sort of passive sit back and watch mode, and they feel like they're just watching a regular show, and they forget that they're supposed to be participating. But of course, also every time you present a choice, it interrupts things, and it interrupts the flow a little bit, and it brings the audience back. It brings the viewer sort of back into participating, but it does interrupt the flow. So how often do you do that? And that was a tricky thing to address as well. And we ended up deciding to aim for a target of about every 2 minutes. And of course, we weren't rigid about it, but we wanted to see sort of every 2 minutes or so, we wanted to bring the audience back in and say, okay, now what do you want to do? Okay, let's play this out for 2 minutes, and then let's do another one. And then as we can see from the flow chart, and as I'm sure you guys know from your work in your class, although I guess I'll expand a little bit for the people that aren't part of the class, there are basically only so many different types of choices you can do. There's sort of the A-B choice, which I mentioned at first, which is a totally branching story. Do you go this way or do left or right? And the story just completely branches from that point on. Now, in our context, it's really difficult to do those kinds of choices too much because of what I was talking about, where you've now split your audience. You've now diluted your resources 50% on each side. So another way to sort of have more choices happen is to have choices that split and then rejoin. So you've got the two paths to the same destination. And the very first one in the episode is one of those where Carmen's presented with a choice of, we need to get in this building. Do you want to go through the top floor or through the ground floor? And they talk a little bit about the pros and cons, and the viewer gets to make a choice. Each one of those is a different experience, but they rejoin once she's reached her objective inside. And so we've rejoined the main sort of spine of the story at that point, and then everybody is sort of along the spine at that point onwards, continuing. A sort of secondary option of the left and right path is something we did a few times, where it's not really sort of two paths to the same thing. It's the direct path or the short detour. So there are a couple of things where a choice is to do one thing or the other, and there aren't even two separate branches. There's just, if you go one way, you see some extra stuff, and then you rejoin where the first choice takes you right away. So that's another way of sort of doing the two branches joining the same spine. And then another thing is the dead end. There's a clear right or wrong where the mission fails or the character dies. And we had a bunch of those as well. And one thing we learned, I'll get to that in the technical side of things. But the biggest sort of aha moment for me in working on the Netflix special was these things we call memory states, which is when you make a choice, it saves a memory state in the system of what your choice was. And you can then continue on from that point, but the decision you made gets saved in the Netflix sort of engine. And then later on in the story, much later, you can have a completely different thing happen based on what your choice was way earlier. And that was the real aha moment for me. When I learned about that aspect of it, I was like, oh, that's amazing, because you can do something and then have this hidden thing that's sort of following you as a consequence of your actions, that's then going to impact something that happens much later. And it's not immediately after the decision. And I thought, oh, that's great. And so that was something that we had a lot of fun with. And there are two key ones of those in the Carmen special. There's one with whether you decide to help Tigress or not when Tigress falls into a pit.
Help me out of here! Now! Just this once, I could help Tigress, or I can leave her to claw her own way out.
And then there's another where you decide to trust Julia and tell her what's really going on, or you decide to trick her and basically lock her on the rooftop.
I've joined forces with Jules before. Trusting her could work again. But if Vile gets any hint that I'm colluding with Acme, who knows how they'd retaliate? It might be best to trick Julia and keep her out of the way.
And so those memory states are really neat because it seems like there's something playing off. You've got a choice and there's sort of an immediate thing. And you're like, oh, okay, that's cool. But then the choices you made in those situations impact the endings that you reach much later on, because you then go back to those characters, to Tigress or Julia, and you need their help, or you don't know you need their help and they help you anyway. And whether or not they help you is a payoff based on what you did much earlier. And so that was a really cool aspect. That was my favorite part of the choice structure that we had in Carmen. And that basically, in my opinion, sort of like it's you can have your cake and eat it too, because the viewer gets to make a choice and then you get to return to sort of this main storyline that you put all your sort of efforts and storytelling efforts into, but then you get the sort of two different endings that are up to what the viewer did. And then some other just interesting challenges I'll try to just touch on quickly is, challenges and things were the idea of being able to kill off your main character or have her fail, which in the normal course of the episodes, we would never do. But the fact that this was this multiple interactive story thing meant that, like, we can have Carmen fail and have her fail like really dramatically in a way that it seems like there's no coming back from. And that was kind of fun. And we used it, in the inevitable frustrations that come with working on stuff. We would just pull that out as a joke all the time. And we come up, we're banging our heads against some obstacle and we're like, well, she should just die. Like, we'll just kill her at that point, and that solves that problem. And we're like, oh, great, because we had this flexibility to do all these crazy things. And then another interesting challenge from the story point was the whole, what is canon? And with Carmen, we were coming into to doing this with a show that had 2 seasons behind us when we were working on the interactive special. So there's first the question of when does it take place? And that was sort of like what characters are involved. We had to leave a couple of characters out of the interactive special because we decided that the interactive special basically happens between season 2 and 3. And so that meant we couldn't have Shadow-san in the interactive special, because if you were watching the interactive special before watching season 1 or 2, we didn't want to give away that Shadow-san is, well, I don't want to give things away. Anyway, we had to leave him out. For people that haven't watched the show, we had to leave him out because we didn't want to define what his role was at that point in the event that people hadn't watched the show yet. And the same with Chase. At the end of season 2, Chase's situation is pretty open and ambiguous. And so we didn't want to complicate the interactive special by his role in it. So there are a couple of really major characters that we had to leave out completely. But then in the other context of what's canon, is anything in the interactive special canon? Because you have all these different choices. The viewer gets to decide what's happening, and you can get to all these different endings. And we basically just sort of had to treat the interactive special as a, like, Carmen Sandiego goes to Las Vegas. What stays in Vegas, or what happens in Vegas, stays in Vegas. So like the whole interactive special is just kind of walled off, and we're like, it's this thing that happens and you get to decide stuff, but none of the stuff that happens in the interactive special could tie into the main sort of canon storytelling that we were doing on the show. We couldn't have any major plot developments or character developments that were critical to the main overall story arcs that we were doing on the show. So it was really interesting because it had to build off all the stuff we had done, but it couldn't take away from it. So that was another really interesting story issue. And then just the last story thing, the bonus rockapella ending sequence, which is just a one-off thing, that if you complete one of the successful endings, Chief says, here's a bonus scene that you can see. And we basically wanted to do that because ever since the show started, we wanted to figure out a way to have some kind of, some sort of involvement of the original Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego rockapella song that so many people know about. And we hadn't really been able to do that on the show yet. So we were like, that's our bonus scene. We get to do this musical number. Everybody on the crew had so much fun doing it. And we were so excited because like there were all these, you'd see these things from the fans going like, yeah, well, I just hate that there's no rockapella thing. Like, how can they not have rockapella in the show anywhere? And we were like, oh, just wait, it's coming. We're working on it and it's really cool and you're gonna really like it. And I think that's one of the highlights that people have really enjoyed with the special is the rockapella number, which was a ton of fun. And you wouldn't get to do that normally. It's like, hey, here's this one-off bonus scene that isn't connected to anything else. All the characters are breaking the fourth wall. They're singing. Like, it was just a ton of fun to do that. So that was kind of a liberating story thing that we got liberated from with the regular episode. And I'm just aware of my time, so I'm going to try to get through the execution stuff so we have some time for questions. As I mentioned, the show had about 60 minutes of total content runtime, but of course, anyone watching isn't going to see the full 60 minutes unless they're like a hardcore completionist that's going to go back and just watch it over and over again. And for those people, bless them, that's great, because the more people watch it, the more Netflix goes, oh, we want you guys to do more of this stuff. That's great. But of course, from a technical standpoint, it was not at all like just 3 of our normal episodes. So our episodes are normally about 23 minutes long. So you budget the time and the money and resources for 3 of those and you figure, oh, you've got your 60 minutes covered. But of course it didn't work that way because there was so much, it's a different beast. And there were so many different challenges that we came up against that we had to problem solve that we wouldn't have had to do with a normal episode. That it was really challenging to sort of get through all the stuff that came up in that same amount of time and with the same number of people. And the first challenge that came up, obviously, the obvious one is the choice interface. And I'll just share my screen again to sort of show you what we ended up on. Here we go. So this looks pretty straightforward and simple, but a lot of work went into this. We basically, when Carmen does her choices, we decided to go into this sort of letterbox thing. We needed to have a clear difference between the regular episode and the choice modes. And different interactive specials have approached this differently. Bandersnatch really went for something that was as seamless as possible. It's almost unnoticeable. The sort of black bar for the choice comes up at the bottom and there's just white text. It's really minimal. And the stuff on screen doesn't really noticeably change. The film style doesn't change. The lighting doesn't change. It still looks just like the rest of the episode. You've just got this really subtle sort of choice coming up. And that works really well for Bandersnatch, and it works well for a sophisticated audience. But for what we were doing and knowing that kids were going to be involved, we went for something that was more of a more clear, almost like a game interface kind of a thing. But we didn't want to just cut away to some interface. We did want to have it sort of seamlessly integrate. So the reason I did a screen grab here is because the interface itself, the buttons, they're generated on Netflix's side because they're dynamic. But I'll show you what it looks like. Let me see if I can here we go.
The building's sure to be buzzing with security. What's the cleanest route to the vault?
You can infiltrate from the top floor or from the ground floor.
Entering from the top floor is sure to require some high-wire stunts, but sneaking up from the ground floor risks facing opposition. To find out what Vile is hiding, I need to get inside that tower.
So this is the way we always started the choice points, is we would put Carmen dead center, front on shot, and then we would go into this letterbox thing.
Entering from the top.
And the lighting changes a little bit on her just to make it sort of a little more noticeable that we're entering a different mode. And we would do some multiplaning effects where she sort of shifts forward, the letterboxes come in, and then the choices come out from her on each side.
From the top.
She talks about them.
Floors sure to require some high-wire stunts.
So she's talking about that side, looking in that direction, and then we have this stylized thing coming up on the one side.
But sneaking up from the ground floor risks facing opposition.
Talks about the other one comes in. A lot of stuff went into this. In an earlier version of it, we went for much more detailed animation. We were like, well, we want to show sort of what the choices could potentially be. So they were much more fully animated. And I think at one point we even had there were cuts in them and stuff. And we really quickly realized that we couldn't make them too complicated because they were too distracting. Because when you had them both going, the audience didn't know where to look. They didn't know. Carmen's in the middle. She's talking about the choices. So you kind of have to pay attention to her. But then the choices are being visually presented on either side of her, and you kind of need to pay attention to those too. So there's a lot of information coming at the audience, and we came up with this stylized thing. What we call these is, we ended up calling them moving graphics. And we had this very stylized illustration style that we went with, where Carmen has simplified drawings in the background. You can see she doesn't have as much details on her feet or her hands. The guard is much more simplified. They have different textures on them. There's this grid to make it look different. And then we had to loop them, because another part of it is we had to sort of keep things dynamic. You're waiting for the audience to make a choice, but we had to get this balance between having a little bit of life still happening on the screen, so it doesn't just stop dead, because as soon as everything stops dead on the screen, that's really bad. People think oh, is there a glitch, or did it hang? Or so you kind of need to let them know that the situation is still alive. And of course, you'd have the counter counting down when the interface is there. But you can't have too much movement. So just enough movement, not too much. That was something that we had to do a lot of experimenting with. And also with the lighting levels, how bright the choices were in the background versus how bright Carmen was in the foreground.
To find out what Vile is hiding, I need to get inside that tower.
And then Carmen also has different levels of dialogue, where she's sort of waiting for you to make your decision. And there are these lines where she's kind of reminding you, she's talking about gosh, what do I do? But she's also kind of reminding you that you have to make this decision too. So there was a lot of thought and a lot of testing that went into the interface. The tutorial, which I think I mentioned, was challenging because we had to do all these different versions of it based on how people were watching this thing on Netflix, because you have to be prepared for all these different versions. So that was another challenging thing. And we have a backup tutorial where there's the first time when Chief tells everybody how to do things. And then the first time a choice happens, if you don't make a choice, Chief comes back.
Hello? Did you forget that for this mission you were on Carmen's crew? You make the decisions. You control the story.
Because we found in testing that sometimes people would forget. They would just get used to watching a show. And we all have so much built up experience in just sitting back and watching TV that you need to overcome that and remind people like, hey, you got to kind of pay attention and keep the remote handy or have your mouse handy and get pulled back into it. So there's a certain amount of training the audience. Some audience members had it right away, probably people that are more used to playing video games or probably younger people. As soon as the choice would come up, they're like, yeah, I get it, boom. Like they didn't even have to get to the tutorial, which is another thing we did is when people didn't need it, the tutorial just didn't happen. If they just jumped into making the choices, then we were like, oh yeah, they're good. We don't need to teach them about that. Some other challenges that we came up with is very early on, we had a dead ending, a fail state where Carmen's presented with the choice of like, you're going to play along and steal with Vile, or you're going to go try to rescue your friends right away, chase the van and rescue your friends right away. And if you chase the van, it's a dead end. It's a false end. It seems like the thing you should do. You should try to go rescue your friends right away. And so a lot of people did it. And initially we just had the ending like, oh, you failed. That's it. It's over. And so we presented people with the option of, do you want to start over or is that it? And this is like 3-4 minutes into the thing. And some people would just like, there were some people in the testing that would just be like, yeah, whatever, that's fine. And they just wouldn't continue. And we were like, well, that's no good. Like it's all over too fast. We've got to sort of get them back into the story and be like, this is what could happen, but we're just going to take you back to the choice and let you do it again. And because having a really hard dead end too early, you will have some viewers who there are different kinds of viewers that do different things. And some people want to win and they want to get to the good ending. And what other people do is they want to test the world. They want to break the world. And it's part of what makes interactive stuff and video games interesting is you can have these choices that you don't get in the real world. You can be like, I'm going to run in front of that car and see what happens. You can't do that in the real world, but in a game world, which people, automatically know a story like this is, they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to see what happens if the fail thing just happens and I'm going to tell Carmen to jump off a cliff or whatever. And so you have to sort of build the story to accommodate all those different types of viewers. And give people the freedom to make those decisions if they want to, but not necessarily do it right away and be like, okay, you can do that later, but if you've not come to a dead end right away, we're just going to kind of loop you back in actively and not give you the choice to just let it end at that point. And then there were some other challenges about just specific things about how to make things more efficient that we were able to do in animation, because there were a few sequences right in the middle. One of the biggest choices you get to make in the show from a production standpoint is the first caper that you do is for Coach Brunt, and you go try to steal a terracotta warrior in China. And that's just the first caper for everybody. The second and third caper, you're presented with a choice of, do you do Cleo's caper or Bellum's caper first? And that's kind of a fun choice to decide which one you want to do first. So you do one of them. And then after you do one, you have the choice of, do you do the third one? Do you play along and do the third caper? Or do you go try to rescue your friends in the Arctic? And depending on which caper you did first, you're sort of returning to the main spine. You're returning to a common point that all the story goes through, but you've just come from two different places. And so we had to figure out how to solve that. The expensive and difficult way would be have two totally separate branches still happening at that point. But that would have meant we'd have to do different backgrounds and different compositing and lighting all the way through those two branches. And that wasn't feasible, or it would have taken resources away from other places. So this is all about like, where do you want to spend your resources? So what we came up with is this, this solution of having Carmen go to a way station, a neutral way station. And thankfully, with the way the show works, Carmen's a globetrotting thief and she goes all over the world. We were like, oh, well, she's got to do all this traveling anyway. Let's put her in an airport. So we picked Heathrow, and we basically made it so that after completing these capers, Vile goes, well, stand by, we're going to give you some more information. And then a little while later, we pick up Carmen and she's at Heathrow, and it just really worked naturally because you're like, oh, we never show her traveling to different places anyway, but it makes sense that she would be at an airport. Actually, we do sometimes. And that was just a good sort of neutral hub to go back to, because it's a literal hub, of course. And so we did that a few times where we pick up Carmen at Heathrow and she gets new information and then heads out again. And the beauty of that is it doesn't really matter where she's coming from or where she's going to, because you can pass through this hub in a couple different ways. And that does happen a few different ways in the episode. And yeah, we were able to do it just using the sort of same background and lighting for the most part. So that's sort of it. There's another thing I can touch on briefly, which was that we come up with on our show all the time, which was we always want to have things as accurate as possible and be able to go to real places. Problem is, in the real world, you have to get legal clearance to use real places often. There's all kinds of rules about what buildings you're allowed to show, what counts as a landmark that can be depicted in a TV show. And the other really tricky thing is different countries have different rules about what's fair use and what you can do. And sometimes it's really hard to get permission to do these things. So with the Terracotta Warriors in China, we didn't get permission to use the actual Terracotta Warrior Museum, but there's no definitive proof that more Terracotta Warriors don't exist buried somewhere else. So we couldn't show the real, actual cool terracotta thing in China, but we could say, oh, they just unearthed some new Terracotta Warriors in this other place that looks kind of similar, but it's different. And so Carmen's going to go there instead. And we were able to talk about the history of the actual Terracotta Warriors, because that's just history and we're allowed to sort of talk about that. But because we couldn't get legal clearance to use the actual museum, which is a structure and a legal thing that has certain copyright laws, we had to sort of fictionalize that part. So just as a quick wrap up, before we get to some questions, interactive story is really interesting, and it's a very challenging beast. And as someone coming from sort of a linear story background, I really enjoyed it. It was really interesting. It was the way we could have, in some ways it's liberating, because of course the burden of linear storytelling is you have to choose the one right thing. You have to say this happens and then this happens and this is the outcome. And once you embrace the idea of like, oh, there's multiple possibilities, it's kind of liberating to be able to say, oh yeah, well, the fail thing, which is really cool. Like you can just have the fail thing, like at the end, Ivy and Zach turn into zombies and Carmen gets brainwashed, and like, that's fun to do without having to actually stick to it. But then just being able to sort of play out all these different options was really neat. It was very cool. And that's why I structured the poll question the way I did. Earlier, I was thinking, oh, everything sort of boils down into the story stuff or the execution stuff. I should make a poll. And then I was like, but I really think the story stuff should go first. So I thought about making the poll in a way that that obscured the actual destination. Like, okay, does everybody want to go to the high mountaintop or go through the forest? And then you guys would have to choose that. And whichever you voted for, we would go to the thing I wanted to go to. Because as the storyteller and as the author, you have the ability to make those decisions and control the outcome. And so there's an interesting tension between, it's like a push and a pull. It's like, how much am I going to let the audience decide versus how much am I going to hold on to and say like, well, no, this is what should happen. I'm going to control this part of the story. So I found that really interesting. So then I added the third option to the poll of, you guys want to leave it up to me as the author of the lecture. Do you want to go by my judgment of the way that I think it should happen? And then I just thought it'd be an interesting thing to talk about if anybody had questions. So yeah, that's pretty much everything. And hopefully we have time for some questions now.
We definitely do. Thank you so much. That was so exciting to watch, even for me, who's like heard some of this over the kitchen table, as it were, over the years. This has been so educational. So I'm going to just, we've got some really good questions coming up in the chat. So the first question that I'm going to ask here is from George, who's asking, did this venture in nonlinear interactive storytelling interest you in potentially working in video games?
Yeah, definitely. Out in Vancouver, where I am here, the sort of regular animation industry is really strong and the video game industry is really strong. And there are a lot of my colleagues and people that I work with that sort of move fluidly between games and television and features. So I haven't really worked in games yet, but yeah, I'd definitely be interested in it. In fact, the co-director, am I allowed to say this? The co-director of the first 2 seasons, Kenny Park, who also worked on the interactive special with me, he, when he left the show, he went to go work at a game studio. I probably can't talk about what he was working on, but yeah, I'm definitely interested in the potential of working on games. It's probably not my first preference, but I would definitely wouldn't rule it out, and I would definitely be open to the possibility. Yeah. And obviously there's so much range in video games. I mean, video games is almost just like saying food. Like it encompasses so much stuff, and there's so many different types of games. And but yeah.
So here's a question from Tian Yi. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. For future interactive projects, what would you improve on in terms of storytelling?
I think for a future one, I'd try to figure out how to leverage the memory state thing more. I'd try to get more out of that, because that was my favorite element of the way you can do things on Netflix. And it's a lot more challenging up front with the writing. It really does require a new way of thinking about things. That was the other thing, is when you're doing something the way we did it in a television production model. Basically, once the script was done, we couldn't change it. You can't really. There were like tweaks that we could do to the execution and to the structural stuff, and you could do small changes. You can record additional dialogue if you need a new line of dialogue that comes up, but you can't do major reworking of stuff once everybody's up and running. It's like a big train, and once you're moving down the track, you can't just go, oh, we should be on that track over there. Like it's you've got to sort of commit to your script. So yeah, maybe just like we learned from all the writing that we did the first time, and we'd try to put more work into the memory state. And if you get the flow chart, and if you get your map working really well, then executing it is fairly straightforward. But it's just all that additional work to get that the flow chart and thing done up front. So I'd put more work into that, and do more memory states, and probably more failure endings too, because they're just fun, and try to get away with making them more disturbing.
So there's a question here from Austin asking, did you play a lot of interactive games / choose your own adventure games when you made it? Which kind of also leads me to think, when I was watching Bandersnatch and kind of, in this historical era of the Choose Your Own Adventure book, which I remember you reading when we were younger. How much did all of that kind of feed into the creative process for the show?
We definitely looked at other interactive specials. When we started working on it, it was early enough that there weren't very many other Netflix interactive things out. Bandersnatch came out, I think, fairly late in when we were working on ours. I think the Puss in Boots one was out. There was, I think, 1 or 2 other ones, and then we got to see previews of a couple of the other ones that were in the pipeline at the time, to sort of see how other shows were handling it. But we were one of the really early ones, and so we were all learning. Netflix was learning, we were learning. And there were regular things where we'd have a meeting with Netflix. I got to go down to Silicon Valley, to Netflix's headquarters in Silicon Valley, and a small team of us went down there, and we got to participate in the testing and see all of this stuff. And it was just really neat to sort of feel like you're on this cutting edge of thing of everybody figuring stuff out. So we had a little bit of stuff to look at and to see sort of what worked, what we thought worked, and what didn't work. But some of it Netflix let us decide and use our judgment, and sometimes they would say, well, we would really like this to happen this way, and they would give us guidance on, like, we think the timer should be this long, or whatever. So there was kind of a back and forth, but there wasn't a ton of this kind of interactive stuff to look at when we were working on it. And I didn't have time to play a lot of other video games that might not have related as much to what we were doing.
Cool. So there's a question from Caitlin saying, I'm interested in the idea that the audience branching off is conceptualized as losing half the audience. In a lot of games and interactive fiction, people replay, or reread, often until they exhaust all the possibilities, which you mentioned. Not just superfans either. If you approached the issue as keeping your audience for double, at least, of the time, rather than wasting resources, would that change your / Netflix's perception with regard to what's worth making?
Yeah, probably. And I think because of the amounts of money that are involved in making this stuff and the production budgets and things, that was the bonus we were thinking about. So we were thinking about replay and people going back and being like, and then hopefully they'll go back and they'll try this other route. We were like, that's ideal. And hopefully that's what's happening. But I think nobody wanted to feel like that was what we were counting on. So we were like, that might happen, but we also had to be prepared for the casual viewer who maybe doesn't play video games as much and isn't as interested in the repeat viewing. Because part of the problem of repeat viewing for something like this, where it is passive for like bigger stretches of time, is it requires kind of more patience, and you have to be willing to just see the same thing again. In a video game, it's a little bit different because you might be able to, like if you're navigating across a level, you could take a completely different path through the level, or you could, you're like, oh, last time I just went in guns blazing, this time I'm going to try a stealth approach and like flank them around the side. So there might be more kind of replay value that's inherent in video games. With this, if we're saying to get to the choice point, you've got to watch through 6 minutes of the same thing again, that would be great if people do, but I think we were sort of saying we can't count on that. So yeah, it was an interesting sort of tension between those things. And we definitely, and obviously there are audience members out there that did rewatch tons of stuff. The fact that somebody did that flowchart and posted it on Reddit means they played the whole thing out comprehensively, and they know.
In one version, Carmen dies.
Sorry, what's that?
I said, if you floated out that in one version, Carmen dies, and you have to just like organize it, you'd have people playing.
Start a rumor that's not actually even true, you mean?
Yeah, gotta find this Easter egg that doesn't exist. Yeah.
This is a question from George asking, what is something about the project that you are most proud of that you feel might get overlooked at first glance?
Okay, a really small detail actually that I'm quite proud of. Well, a couple of things. I'm proud of the opening that we came up with, that where the script just said, and a big thing happens, and that happens sometimes where I mean, we have fantastic writers on the show and they're really good, but just inevitably sometimes something gets written that needs some real problem solving on it, and that's some of the stuff that I find the most interesting and exciting is coming to that problem solving and saying, okay, well, we need to get from A to B, and it's not clearly defined how to do that, or there are some unexpected obstacles or whatever. But one of the things I really liked was the rockapella thing. And maybe I'll just play if people have the patience to do this for a sec. At the beginning of the rockapella thing, like the music starts, and it starts with Zach and Ivy doing this beatboxing and stuff, but we didn't really know how to get into it. How do you launch that? And so I came up with this idea of this water pipe, because they're being kept prisoner, and they're just really bored in there, and so they're doing this because they're bored. So I came up with this idea of this water pipe, this drip of water. And I thought it'd be funny if Zach's just lying under it and it's falling on his forehead, and it's just doing this rhythm. And you're listening to the water pipe, and then he starts tapping his finger. And then that's sort of, he's got this rhythm going, and that's kind of what leads it, because he's just bored out of his mind. And so he just starts doing this crazy beatboxing, and that's what launches into the whole rockapella thing. And that was something that we need to come up with, and I'm sort of proud of that solution. So maybe we can just watch it quickly for the people that haven't seen it.
Well, she sneaks around the world from Kiev to Carolina.
She's a sticky-fingered filcher from Berlin down to Belize.
She'll take you for a ride on a slow boat to China. Tell me,
Where in the world is
Carmen Sandiego?
Yeah.
So if you want to see the whole thing, you have to play through and you have to get to one of the successful endings, and then you have to select the bonus scene. Or you can find it on YouTube too, actually.
Well, that is fantastic. I'm going to ask one last question and exercise my right as moderator to ask my own question, which is that given that Carmen Sandiego started out as an educational game to help kids learn geography, how do you feel that sort of animation like this in general, but then especially like interactive things can be educational?
Interactive things in particular, do you mean like just the interactive special in particular, or the show?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like an overall question about edutainment and education and what things like animation, popular culture, and interactivity all bring to that. That's a way big question. You can answer it however you like.
That is a big question. Well, obviously, I think the potential is huge, and yeah, that's how Carmen Sandiego started. Of course, was as an interactive educational game where the viewer, the audience, the player has to use their knowledge and hopefully learn things to sort of move the story forward, and I think there's huge potential for that. Is one of the things that I sometimes wish we could have done more of on the show, is because we do have obviously some educational stuff, and we have our little info sessions that happen in each episode where they talk about the place that they're going to, and we've also really tried to sort of, as I mentioned a couple of times, we've tried to have as many details, really small, authentic details as possible, and we've taken some heat for not getting all of them right, which is fair enough. But we really we put a lot of effort into trying to get the details, just the richness of the world. Like, the world is such a neat, interesting place, and there's so many cool, different parts of it and different people in it, that it's been really good to sort of try to show that as much as possible in the show. And I definitely think there was room for more of it. What we've been doing with the show is really doing more of a traditional story with a little bit of educational stuff and a little bit of geographical stuff in there. And that's a balance that could easily be shifted one way or another. And definitely in an interactive context, I think that would be a great way to do it. Another way to obviously do the show is to, instead of just having A/B choices, you could do an interactive special where there's more of multiple choice things, or like, more details about the world and more things that you could learn. And actually, there was some of that. There was a Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego done recently through Google Earth, that maybe some people saw, because I think it was all over Google for a while ago. And that sort of was a little bit more of that. It wasn't as much of a story thing. It was a little bit more sort of educational. But yeah, I think the potential is wide open. And because of the globetrotting nature of the show and the way it started, that potential is really built into the Carmen world.
That is a fabulous note to end on. So I want to thank you very, very much on behalf of York Cinema and Media Arts, and behalf of Caitlin's class, for coming here into this wonderful Zoom ether of ours, and sharing all this fabulous stuff with us. And you're just getting thanks all the way down the chat.
And I'm going to thank Allison too. Jos, that was spectacular. Loved it. I've always been a huge Carmen Sandiego fan, and I love her more now. So thank you for everybody who joined us. It's, we know you have so many options of things to do. So thank you for coming and sharing the time with us here in CMA. And we hope you come back to join other events. And thank you for your patience and us running a little bit long, but I think you'll agree with me that it was worth it. Thank you, Jos.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me. It was great to be on.